The sun hung low over the fields as Walter Harris sat on the weathered porch of his small farmhouse in rural Texas. The chirping of crickets blended with the faint rustle of leaves, creating a serene backdrop to another solitary evening. Walter leaned back in his creaky rocking chair, the wood groaning beneath his weight. A half-empty cup of coffee sat forgotten on the table beside him, its steam long gone. At 70, Walter had grown accustomed to the stillness. The years had passed slowly since he retired from his work as a trainer and caretaker of elephants. His days were simple now, tending to his small vegetable garden, fixing fences, and occasionally venturing into town for supplies. But tonight, the silence felt heavier than usual, as if the past were creeping back to sit beside him. In his hands, Walter held a faded photograph of a young elephant. Her large, soulful eyes stared back at him, framed by long lashes. Her name was scrawled in his handwriting at the bottom corner, Nia. He traced the name with his calloused fingers, memories flooding back unbidden. Nia had been one of the first elephants he'd rescued from a traveling circus. She'd arrived at the sanctuary trembling and thin, with scars on her legs from years of chains. Walter had spent months gaining her trust, sitting for hours outside her enclosure, talking to her softly until she felt safe enough to approach. Eventually, she'd learned to trust him, and a bond had formed between them, one that Walter had never quite replicated with any other animal. But that had been 20 years ago. When Nia was transferred to a larger sanctuary in another state, Walter had been forced to say goodbye. At the time, he had told himself it was for the best. She needed more space and care than his sanctuary could provide. Yet, even as he told himself it was the right decision, the parting had left a hole in his heart that had never fully healed. Walter sighed deeply and set the photo down, gazing out at the horizon. He hadn't thought about Nia in years, but tonight, for some reason, her memory felt as vivid as if she were standing right in front of him. The sound of gravel crunching under tires broke his reverie. Walter turned his head to see the mail carrier's truck pulling up to his gate. The driver, a young woman in her early 20s, waved cheerfully as she handed him a stack of letters. "Evening, Mr. Harris," she called out. Walter nodded in acknowledgement, thanking her as she drove away. He flipped through the letters absently. Bills, advertisements, a flyer for a local charity event, until his fingers froze on a thick envelope bearing the logo of the Carolina Elephant Sanctuary. He stared at the envelope for a moment before carefully opening it. Inside was a handwritten letter from Thomas Gregory, one of his former colleagues. "Dear Walter, I hope this letter finds you well. It's been a long time since we last spoke, but I'm reaching out because I thought you'd want to know something important. Nia is here with us at the Carolina Sanctuary." Walter's heart skipped a beat as he continued reading. "She's been with us for many years now. She's healthy, though she still carries the emotional scars from her past. I thought you might want to visit her. I know how much she meant to you, and I think seeing you might be good for her, and for you." The letter ended with contact information and an invitation to visit the sanctuary whenever he was ready. Walter sat motionless, the letter trembling in his hands. For years he had assumed he would never see Nia again. Yet, here she was, alive and well, waiting for him. That night, Walter lay in bed, unable to sleep. His mind replayed the memories of his time with Nia, her first hesitant steps toward him, the way she'd used her trunk to gently nudge his hat off his head, the soft rumble of contentment she'd made when he scratched behind her ears. But doubt gnawed at him. 20 years was a long time. Would Nia even remember him? Or was he chasing a memory that no longer held meaning for her? And then there was his own condition to consider. Age had slowed him down, and his joints ached with every movement. A long journey to another state wasn't something he could undertake lightly. Still, as the night stretched on, one thought became clear. He had to see her again. Whether or not she remembered him, he owed it to her and to himself to try. By morning, Walter had made his decision. He dusted off an old suitcase from the closet, packed a few essentials, and loaded them into his aging pickup truck. Before leaving, he took one last look at the photograph of Nia, slipping it into his pocket. "Let's see if you still remember this old fool," he muttered with a faint smile. With the engine rumbling to life, Walter pulled out of his driveway and onto the open road, his heart heavy with anticipation and a glimmer of hope. Walter's old pickup truck rumbled steadily along the highway, the scenery shifting from the flat, sun-baked plains of Texas to rolling hills and patches of dense forest. The journey to the Carolina Elephant Sanctuary was long, nearly 2 days by road, but Walter had refused to take a plane. The thought of airports, with their crowds and noise, made his chest tighten. Out here on the open road, he felt a sense of calm, though his mind was far from at ease. The photo of Nia sat propped up on the dashboard, her gentle eyes watching him as if to urge him forward. Walter stole glances at it now and then, the corners of his mouth tugging upward in a faint smile. Yet, doubts lingered in the back of his mind. 20 years, he muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. It's been 20 long years. What if she doesn't recognize me? What if... He let the thought trail off, shaking his head as if to banish the idea. That night, Walter stopped at a small roadside motel just outside of Nashville. The room was modest. A single bed, a TV bolted to the wall, and a chair that looked like it hadn't been replaced since the 80s. He sank into the bed with a sigh, his bones protesting after the long hours behind the wheel. As he stared at the cracked ceiling, memories of Nia played in his mind like an old movie reel. He remembered the day she arrived at the sanctuary all those years ago, a thin, frightened creature with a haunted look in her eyes. It had taken weeks of patience to coax her out of her shell. Walter had spent hours sitting near her enclosure, talking to her in a soothing voice, offering her treats and simply waiting. He'd learned quickly that elephants had their own way of grieving, of holding on to pain, but they also had a remarkable capacity for forgiveness and love. He smiled at the memory of Nia using her trunk to pull the brim of his hat down over his eyes, a playful habit she'd developed once she began to trust him. It was those small moments of connection that had made all the long days worthwhile. The next morning, Walter set out early, eager to complete the final leg of his journey. The air grew cooler as he approached the Carolina foothills, the landscape dotted with tall pines and sprawling meadows. By the time he reached the sanctuary, the sun was high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the rolling fields. The sight of the sanctuary's entrance, a large wooden sign reading Carolina Elephant Refuge, sent a wave of emotion crashing over him. Walter parked his truck and stepped out, stretching his stiff legs. A sense of nervous anticipation settled in his chest as he looked around. The sanctuary was expansive, with open fields enclosed by sturdy fencing and clusters of trees providing shade for the elephants. Walter! He turned to see a familiar figure approaching. Thomas Gregory, his former colleague, was grinning broadly as he extended a hand. "Thomas," Walter said, shaking his hand firmly, "it's been a long time." "It sure has," Thomas replied, clapping him on the shoulder. "I was so glad to hear you were coming. You look good considering you've been off the grid for so long." Walter chuckled. "Retirement does that to you, keeps you out of trouble most of the time." Thomas gestured for Walter to follow him. "Come on, let me show you around. I think you'll like what we've done here." As they walked through the sanctuary, Thomas pointed out various enclosures and introduced Walter to some of the elephants. Each one had its own story, some rescued from circuses, others from logging camps or private owners who had kept them in unsuitable conditions. Walter nodded politely, but his mind was elsewhere. "What about Nia?" he asked, unable to contain his impatience any longer. Thomas smiled knowingly. "She's out in the south field. That's where she spends most of her time. You'll see her soon." They continued walking until they reached a shaded area near a cluster of trees. There, standing majestically against the backdrop of the forest, was Nia. Walter stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. She was older now, her once smooth skin marked with the faint lines of age, but her eyes, those deep, expressive eyes, were just as he remembered. "She's beautiful," Walter murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Thomas nodded. "She's come a long way, but she still has her moments. The trauma, it doesn't go away entirely. She's cautious around new people, but she's gentle at heart." Walter took a hesitant step forward, his hands trembling. Does she remember people? From her past, I mean." Thomas hesitated before answering. "Sometimes. It depends. Elephants have incredible memories, but it's been a long time, Walter. Don't be discouraged if she doesn't recognize you right away." As Walter approached the fence, Nia turned her head slightly, her ears flicking at the sound of his footsteps. She regarded him with a curious expression, her large frame still and quiet. Walter's heart pounded in his chest. "Hey there, girl," he said softly, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "It's me. Do you remember?" For a moment, Nia didn't move. Then, slowly, she took a cautious step forward, her trunk swaying gently. Walter held his breath as she extended her trunk toward him, her eyes locking onto his. When her trunk brushed against the brim of his hat, just as she used to do all those years ago. Walter felt tears welling up in his eyes. "She remembers," he whispered, his voice breaking. Nia let out a low, rumbling sound, a noise that Walter recognized as a sign of comfort and recognition. He reached out, his hand resting gently on her trunk. "Good girl," he murmured. "I missed you, Nia. I missed you so much." Thomas watched the scene unfold from a distance, a faint smile on his lips. "I told you she was special," he said quietly to himself. As Walter stood there, reconnecting with the elephant who had meant so much to him, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The journey had been worth it, but deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. For the next few minutes, Walter stood by the fence, quietly stroking Nia's trunk as she rumbled softly in response. Every gentle touch, every low sound, seemed to bridge the 20-year gap between them. Walter's heart swelled with a mixture of joy and relief. She remembered him. Despite the years, despite the pain they had both endured separately, the bond they had once shared hadn't been erased. But as the initial excitement faded, Walter began to notice the caution in Nia's movements. She stayed close to him, but her eyes darted around, her body tensing at the smallest sounds. When one of the other caregivers walked by in the distance, she froze, her ears flicking back as she stepped away from the fence. Thomas joined Walter, watching Nia with a thoughtful expression. "She's come a long way, but she still struggles," Thomas said, crossing his arms. "Sometimes when she hears loud voices or sees someone move too quickly, she flinches like she's back in that circus. It's like she's waiting for the next bad thing to happen." Walter's chest tightened. He knew what trauma could do, how it could burrow deep and linger, even after someone, or in this case, an elephant, was physically safe. He had seen it in the other elephants he'd worked with, and now he was seeing it in Nia. "She's still carrying it," Walter murmured, "even after all these years." Thomas nodded. "It's why she's in the south field, away from the others. She prefers to be alone most of the time. But you're the first person she's responded to like this in years. It's like she knows you're different." Walter looked at Nia, who was now tugging gently at a branch with her trunk. The idea of her being isolated, even in a sanctuary, filled him with sadness. "I want to help her," he said firmly. "If she still remembers me, maybe I can do something to bring her out of that shell." Thomas smiled faintly. "You always did have a way with them, but it's going to take time, Walter. You know that as well as anyone." The next morning, Walter returned to the south field at first light. Nia was already awake, her massive frame silhouetted against the rising sun as she grazed on the tall grass. Walter carried a bucket of fruit, bananas, apples, and a few mangoes, and set it down near the fence. "Breakfast, girl," he called gently. Nia lifted her head, her ears flicking forward as she spotted him. Slowly, she ambled over, her steps cautious but deliberate. When she reached the bucket, she sniffed at it before using her trunk to pluck out a banana. Walter chuckled as she devoured the fruit in a matter of seconds. "Still your favorite, huh?" Over the next hour, Walter stayed by the fence, talking to Nia in the same calm, steady voice he'd used all those years ago. He told her about his retirement, about his quiet life on the farm, and about how much he'd missed working with elephants. "I'll admit, it hasn't been easy being away from all this," he said, gesturing to the sanctuary around them. "But seeing you again, it makes me feel like I'm back where I belong." Nia rumbled softly, her trunk brushing against his hand as if to acknowledge his words. Over the next few days, Walter spent hours with Nia, gradually reintroducing some of the activities they used to do together. He brought an old straw hat, one similar to the one she used to pull off his head, and held it out to her. "Remember this?" he asked with a grin. Nia hesitated for a moment before reaching out with her trunk. She tapped the brim of the hat, then gently nudged it off his head just like she used to. Walter laughed, the sound echoing across the field. "That's my girl," he said, his voice warm with affection. But progress wasn't always linear. On the third day, a loud noise, a dropped metal bucket from a worker nearby, startled Nia. She backed away quickly, trumpeting in alarm as her body tensed. Walter stayed still, his hands raised to show her he wasn't a threat. "It's okay, girl," he said softly. "You're safe. No one's going to hurt you here." It took several minutes, but Nia eventually calmed down, her breathing slowing as she returned to the fence. Walter could see the fear lingering in her eyes, and it broke his heart. That evening, Walter sat with Thomas on the porch of the main sanctuary building, nursing a cup of coffee as the sun set behind the trees. "She's made progress, hasn't she?" Walter asked, though his tone was tinged with uncertainty. "She has," Thomas agreed. But you've seen it yourself. Her past still has a hold on her. It's going to take time and patience. But if anyone can help her, it's you. Walter stared into his coffee, his thoughts drifting. She's not the only one carrying things from the past, he admitted quietly. Thomas raised an eyebrow. You talking about Nia or yourself? Walter hesitated before answering. Both, I guess. When she was transferred, I told myself it was for the best, but I always wondered if I'd let her down, if I should have fought harder to keep her. And then there's Rachel. Thomas leaned back, giving him a thoughtful look. Your daughter? Yeah, Walter said with a sigh. We haven't spoken much in years. I was so focused on my work back then, I didn't see how much it was costing me. Now it feels like I don't know how to fix it. Thomas nodded slowly. Maybe this is your chance to fix both. Helping Nia heal might just teach you how to heal yourself and your relationship with Rachel. That night, as Walter lay in bed, he replayed Thomas's words in his mind. He knew Nia's progress wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to keep trying. And perhaps in helping her, he could find a way to mend the other broken pieces of his life. Looking out the window at the moonlit sanctuary, Walter made a silent promise to Nia and to himself. We'll get through this together, he whispered. The day started like the others. The soft hum of the sanctuary's morning activity was a calming backdrop as Walter approached the south field with his bucket of fruit. Nia was grazing in her usual spot, her massive frame casting a long shadow in the early sunlight. Morning, girl, Walter called gently, setting the bucket down by the fence. Nia turned at the sound of his voice, her ears flicking forward in recognition. She lumbered over slowly, her steps deliberate but no longer cautious. Each day she seemed more at ease with his presence, though Walter knew her journey was far from over. Bananas and mangoes, he said with a chuckle as Nia reached into the bucket with her trunk. Your favorites. You're starting to get spoiled, you know that? Nia rumbled softly, a sound Walter had come to associate with contentment. She leaned her trunk over the fence, brushing it against his arm before returning to her fruit. Walter smiled, but his heart remained heavy. He couldn't shake the feeling that, despite their progress, Nia was still holding back. Her trust in him seemed solid, but she remained wary of the other caregivers, her body tensing whenever they came too close. She's come a long way, Thomas said, approaching from behind. But she still doesn't interact with anyone else like she does with you, Walter nodded. She's still scared, and I don't blame her. It's like she's carrying the weight of every bad thing that's ever happened to her. Thomas studied Walter for a moment. You've done more for her in a week than we've been able to do in years, but I think she needs to face something bigger to really start healing. Something that pushes her trust, and yours, to the limit. Later that day, Walter found himself sitting with Thomas in the sanctuary's office. On the desk between them was a large map of the sanctuary, its fields and enclosures marked with neat lines and labels. We've been planning to move Nia to the east field, Thomas explained, pointing to an area shaded in green. It's larger, with more space and better access to water, but she's resisted every attempt we've made to get her there. The process stresses her out too much. Walter frowned. Why the east field? She seems comfortable enough where she is. Thomas sighed. The south field was meant to be temporary. It's smaller, and we've got new arrivals coming in who'll need the space. Besides, the east field has other elephants she could eventually bond with. It's the next step in her recovery. Walter leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. You want me to help move her? Thomas nodded. She trusts you more than anyone. If anyone can get her there without overwhelming her, it's you. The next morning, Walter stood at the edge of the south field, his heart pounding as he watched Nia graze. Moving her to the east field wouldn't be easy. It required guiding her through a narrow corridor between the enclosures, a space she had avoided in the past due to its confined nature. Okay, girl, Walter murmured, taking a deep breath. We're going to try something new today. He approached Nia slowly, holding a bundle of bananas in one hand. She lifted her head at his approach, her trunk reaching out to investigate. Come on, Walter said softly, taking a step back. Follow me. Nia hesitated for a moment, then took a tentative step forward. Walter kept his movements slow and steady, speaking to her in a calm, reassuring tone. That's it. You're doing great. Step by step, they moved toward the corridor. Walter could feel the tension in her body, her steps becoming slower and more deliberate as they approached the narrow passage. The moment they entered the corridor, Nia froze. Her ears flicked back, and her trunk curled close to her body. Walter stopped immediately, turning to face her. It's okay, girl, he said gently. I'm right here. Nothing's gonna hurt you." Nia let out a low rumble, her eyes darting nervously. Walter could see the conflict in her. Part of her wanted to trust him, but another part was paralyzed by fear. Behind them, Thomas and a few other caregivers watched from a distance, their presence adding to the tension. Walter raised a hand, signaling for them to back off. "Just me and you, Nia," he said. "Like old times." Slowly he reached into his pocket and pulled out the straw hat she used to love playing with. He held it out to her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Remember this?" Nia's ears twitched, and after a long moment, she extended her trunk. She brushed the hat gently, then nudged it off his hand, just as she used to. Walter laughed softly, the sound breaking the tension in the air. "That's my girl." With the hat still in her trunk, Nia took another step forward, then another. Walter walked beside her, his voice steady and calm as he guided her through the corridor. When they finally emerged into the east field, Walter felt a wave of relief wash over him. Nia paused, her ears swiveling as she took in her new surroundings. The open space, the tall grass, the distant sound of water, it was all unfamiliar, but she didn't seem afraid. "You did it," Walter said, his voice filled with pride. "You made it." Nia rumbled softly, her trunk brushing against his arm in what felt like a gesture of gratitude. Thomas approached cautiously, keeping his movements slow. "That was incredible," he said quietly. "I don't think she would have done it without you." Walter nodded, his gaze never leaving Nia. "She's stronger than she knows. She just needed a little help to see it." As the sun began to set, Walter sat on a bench near the edge of the east field, watching Nia explore her new space. She seemed more relaxed here, her movements fluid and unhurried. Thomas joined him, handing him a bottle of water. "You know, this is a big step for her," Thomas said, "but it's also a big step for you." Walter frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you're not just helping her heal. You're starting to heal too," Thomas said with a knowing smile. "It's not too late to rebuild some of the things you've lost, Walter. With her and with Rachel." Walter didn't respond immediately, his thoughts drifting to his daughter. Maybe Thomas was right. If Nia could face her fears and take a step forward, maybe he could too. That night, Walter made a decision. Pulling out his phone, he dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Rachel," he said when she picked up. "It's Dad. I was wondering if you'd like to come visit the sanctuary. There's someone here I'd like you to meet." Walter paced nervously near the main sanctuary building, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn-out jeans. It had been years since he'd seen Rachel in person. Their conversations had dwindled to occasional holiday calls, the kind where silence filled the gaps where a real connection should have been. Now he had invited her into a part of his life he'd never truly shared with her. "She's on her way," Thomas said, stepping out from the office. "You nervous?" Walter snorted. "Understatement of the year," Thomas chuckled. "You've faced charging elephants, Walter. I think you can handle a conversation with your daughter." Walter offered a tight smile, but said nothing. His thoughts churned with memories of the last time they'd argued. Rachel accusing him of choosing work over family. Walter insisting he'd done what was necessary to make a difference. The years between then and now had softened his defenses, but guilt still weighed heavily on his shoulders. An hour later, a silver SUV pulled into the sanctuary's gravel driveway. Walter stood rooted to the spot as Rachel stepped out, her dark hair pulled back into a ponytail, her expression cautious but curious. "Hey, Dad," she said, offering a tentative smile. Walter's throat tightened. "Hey, sweetheart, thanks for coming." They stood awkwardly for a moment before Rachel glanced around. "So, where's this elephant you wanted me to meet?" Walter relaxed slightly, grateful for the icebreaker. "She's in the east field. Come on, I'll introduce you." As they approached the enclosure, Rachel's eyes widened at the sight of Nia. The elephant was grazing near the edge of the field, her massive form both imposing and graceful. "She's beautiful," Rachel said softly. "She is," Walter agreed. "And she's been through a lot, just like her trainer." Rachel glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "So, this is what you've been doing all these years? Rescuing elephants like her?" Walter nodded, his voice quiet. "It wasn't just a job, Rachel. It was everything, but I know now that I let it take too much. I let it take me away from you." Rachel looked down, her arms crossed. "I used to think you loved the elephants more than you loved us." The words hit Walter like a punch to the gut, but he didn't flinch. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice steady. "I thought I was doing the right thing, giving my life to something bigger than myself. But I see now that I should have done more to make you feel like you mattered too. Because you do, you always have." Rachel's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but she didn't look away. "I don't want an apology, Dad. I want to know you're here now." Walter nodded slowly. "I am. And if you'll let me, I'd like to show you why this place matters to me, why Nia matters." They spent the afternoon near the East Field, Walter sharing stories about Nia's rescue and her journey toward healing. Rachel listened intently, her initial wariness giving way to genuine interest. When Walter stepped up to the fence and called Nia's name, the elephant turned her head, her ears perking up. She ambled over slowly, her trunk reaching out to brush against Walter's hand. Rachel watched in awe as her father interacted with the elephant. "She really trusts you," she said. "She does," Walter replied, stroking Nia's trunk. "But it took time and patience. Building trust always does." Rachel seemed to take his words to heart. She hesitated for a moment before stepping closer to the fence. Nia regarded her curiously, her trunk extending toward the newcomer. "Go ahead," Walter said gently. "She won't hurt you." With a deep breath, Rachel held out her hand. Nia's trunk brushed against her palm, her touch surprisingly gentle. Rachel laughed softly, her eyes lighting up with wonder. "She's amazing," Rachel said, turning to Walter. "I can see why you've dedicated your life to this." Walter smiled. "She's taught me a lot, about forgiveness, resilience, and second chances." Rachel looked at him, her expression softening. Maybe we both needed one of those. That evening, Walter and Rachel sat on the porch of the main sanctuary building, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was cool, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. "You know," Rachel said, breaking the silence, "I always thought I'd never understand why you chose this life, but now, I think I get it. These animals, this work, it's part of who you are. And maybe I resented that because I didn't feel like I was part of it too." Walter leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I want you to be part of it now, Rachel. I don't want to keep that part of my life separate anymore, and I don't want to lose you again." Rachel smiled faintly. "You haven't lost me, Dad. Not completely. And maybe it's time I stopped holding on to old grudges. We can't change the past, but we can try to do better now." Walter reached over, placing a hand on hers. "That's all I could ever ask for." As they sat there, Nia let out a low rumble from the East Field, her silhouette visible against the fading light. "She's saying good night," Walter said with a chuckle. Rachel laughed. "You speak elephant now?" "Something like that," Walter replied, his grin widening. "They've got their own language, you just have to learn how to listen." Rachel nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe I can stick around for a while, get to know this place and you a little better." Walter's chest swelled with emotion. "I'd like that, Rachel, I'd like that a lot." As the night settled over the sanctuary, Walter felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Nia was healing. Rachel was giving him another chance, and for the first time in a long time he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The early morning sun bathed the sanctuary in golden light, casting long shadows over the open fields. Walter stood near the East Field fence, watching Nia as she ambled across the grass. Her movements were unhurried, her trunk swaying rhythmically as she explored her new surroundings. She seemed more at peace now, more confident. Rachel joined him, carrying 2 cups of steaming coffee. She handed one to Walter and leaned against the fence, her eyes following Nia. "She looks happy," Rachel said, breaking the comfortable silence. Walter nodded. "She's getting there. It's not just about where she is, it's about who's around her. She knows she's not alone anymore." Rachel smiled. "Neither are you, Dad." Walter turned to her, his face softening. "I've spent so many years focused on fixing things for everyone else. These elephants, this sanctuary. I didn't realize how much I needed to fix things with you." Rachel reached over, placing a hand on his arm. "We're fixing it now. That's what matters." Later that day, Walter and Rachel walked through the sanctuary grounds with Thomas, who had been beaming ever since Rachel's arrival. "You know, Walter," Thomas said, "having you here these past few weeks has reminded me of just how much of this place was built on your work. You've left a legacy here, whether you realize it or not." Walter chuckled. "My legacy is a few repaired fences and some dented feeding buckets." Thomas shook his head. "It's more than that. It's in the way these animals trust us, the way they heal. That doesn't happen without people like you." As they passed the East Field, Nia let out a soft rumble, her ears flaring slightly as she approached the fence. Walter stopped, holding out his hand. Nia extended her trunk, brushing it gently against his palm. Rachel watched the interaction with a look of quiet admiration. "You've really built something special here, Dad." Walter looked at her, his eyes glinting with emotion. It's not just mine. It belongs to everyone who's cared enough to help. People like Thomas, the other caregivers, and now, maybe you too. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Me? Thomas grinned. We're always looking for passionate people to join the team, and from what I've seen, you've got a natural way with these animals. Rachel laughed, the sound light and genuine. I don't know about that, but I wouldn't mind sticking around a little longer. Maybe I'll see where it takes me. Walter's heart swelled with pride. For years he had carried the guilt of being absent in Rachel's life. Now seeing her here, sharing his world, he felt a glimmer of hope that their bond could be stronger than ever. As the weeks passed, Walter settled into a new routine. He spent his mornings with Nia, guiding her through exercises to build her confidence and helping her adjust to the other elephants in the East Field. To his delight, she began forming a bond with a younger elephant named Kavi, often seen grazing beside him or playfully nudging him with her trunk. Rachel, meanwhile, had started assisting the caregivers, learning how to prepare food, clean enclosures, and observe the elephants' behaviors. Though she was initially hesitant, her natural curiosity and patience quickly won over the staff and the elephants. One afternoon, as Rachel was helping to refill a water trough, Nia approached her. Rachel froze for a moment, unsure of what to do, but Walter called out from across the field. "She trusts you now," he said with a grin. "Go ahead." Taking a deep breath, Rachel extended her hand. Nia leaned down, her trunk brushing against Rachel's palm before curling around her arm in a gentle embrace. Rachel laughed, her face lighting up with joy. "She's incredible," Rachel said, looking at Walter. "I think I'm starting to understand why you love this so much." Walter smiled. "It's not just about the animals. It's about what they teach us, about trust, resilience, and how to move forward, no matter what we've been through." One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sanctuary in shades of amber and crimson, Walter sat on the porch with Rachel and Thomas. "You know," Walter began, his voice thoughtful, "I spent a lot of years thinking I had to do all this on my own, that it was my responsibility to fix everything. But seeing Nia heal and seeing you here, Rachel, I realize now that healing isn't something you do alone. It's something you do together." Rachel reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "We're doing it, Dad. Together." The story ends on a quiet, hopeful note. Walter watches as Nia and Kavi roam the East Field, their movements graceful and free. Rachel sits beside him, jotting notes in a small notebook about the elephant's behavior, a sign that she's beginning to carve out her own place in this world. For the first time in years, Walter feels a sense of completeness. He has found healing not only for Nia, but for himself and his relationship with Rachel. And in doing so, he has created a legacy of love and connection that will endure long after he's gone. As the stars begin to dot the sky, Walter leans back in his chair, a contented smile on his face. "This is how it was always meant to be," he murmurs. Nia lets out a soft rumble in the distance, as if agreeing.